Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Um, it's going to be headless. The topic is headless. And of course, if you have any questions today, there's the Ask a Question section at the bottom of your screen that you can click, and then you ask your question. And if other people like your question, they can upvote it. And of course, you can upvote others' questions. And by the end of this webinar, we'll take some time to answer the most upvoted questions. And with that, let's go to a quick introduction of our speakers, because the first time I saw Miriam was on October 6, 2013 at 4:45 p.m. when she walked onto the WordCamp Europe stage. And at the time, I worked with WordPress for about 7 weeks. And Miriam had already 7 years of experience. So yeah, that makes 15 years today. In her presentation, she shared mistakes she had made building her agency so that others wouldn't make the same mistakes. And from her talk, I remember 2 things. The impressiveness of combining a big family with building a company. And second, that she's an amazing businesswoman. And she really is, because in 2016, she founded her second company, Strattic. And Strattic is a hosting company unlike any other. They turn your WordPress site into a static and headless site. So it only makes sense that we have her here today as the subject matter expert. And if you've been following our webinars and podcasts, you've seen and heard Joost before. And just like Miriam, Joost is able to combine managing a big family with building a great business. And as a founder and chief product officer, Joost has been closely involved with the Yoast SEO product. I'd even go as far as saying he personally came up with 99% of the features in Yoast SEO. So his work obviously includes the latest version of Yoast SEO, the headless release. So please put your virtual hands together for Miriam and Joost.
That was too much. Okay. Thank you.
It was a very nice introduction. Of course, when I think 2013, I think, boy, was I young.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to discuss, hi, Rebecca. We're going to discuss what is headless and why does everyone seem to want it. If you are in the WordPress community, which it seems like you probably are, then you will see the concept of headless WordPress being mentioned and discussed quite a lot. And like many people, you might be saying, what in the world is that? So I'm going to kind of give an overview of what headless is, and I'm going to talk about a few other terms that overlap. And then some ways that you can implement headless WordPress on your own, and then hopefully we'll discuss this as we go along. Okay, so who am I? Aside from being much younger when Taco first met me, I'm the CEO of Strattic now, and I formerly was the CEO of a web development agency, a WordPress development agency actually, called Luminea. Actually, 15 years in WordPress, he's right. Very, very long time. I organized 5 WordCamps in Israel, and I've spoken at many WordCamps in Israel, outside of Israel, WordCamp Europe and US and London, and it was always really fun doing that. Unfortunately, we can't do that now, but I hope we'll get back to that at some point soon. I'm a mom, as Taco mentioned, the family situation, and you can tweet me at on Twitter at this Miriam Schwab, or you can find me there, whatever. So, okay, when you have a WordPress site, you have the admin, which you log into to manage your content, and then when you click update, you will then see your changes on the front end. Okay, so, oops, here's your back end, and here's your front end. Now, in standard WordPress, they are really tied together, often referred to as monolithic architecture. So it's very closely tied. The front end is immediately impacted by what happens on the back end, both in terms of content updates and otherwise, because the server and everything related to that is right there under the front end of the site that you're viewing. What is headless? Headless is when those 2 parts of the site are no longer connected directly. So the WordPress, and in the case of headless WordPress, you would have the WP admin, which kind of is standalone, and then you would have a front end, which is what the website that people visit, and they're not connected. They're headless. It's also known as decoupled. And so in order for the front end to get updated by the back end, it's generally, the front end is generally updated through something called the REST API. In the case of WordPress, WP GraphQL, also, we'll get to that. But in any case, it's two separate entities. So in standard WordPress, your front end basically has to be built with PHP, right? It's a theme and it's PHP based. Whereas when it's headless or decoupled, your front end, the site that people are visiting, can be built with any framework or technology that you want. Okay, so what is it? So it separates. You can use any technology for the front end. So it could be React, Next.js, Next, whatever you want. The content is accessible via a REST API. So instead of like in the case of WordPress where it's being pulled, let's say from a database, here it's being pulled from the API. And there's another way of doing headless, which is static site generation. Some headless decoupled sites are a combination of static and just general headless. It's kind of, there's a lot of overlap between these terms, so I'll get to that. So I mentioned static site generation. What is that? You may have heard of that as well. So that actually doesn't refer to how dynamic the site is. Static sounds really boring. It sounds like something nobody wants because who wants to be static. But it actually doesn't mean that the site itself is not dynamic. It means that the architecture is static. So it's actually a collection of static files, meaning HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, as opposed to in your standard WordPress site where if you view a content page, let's say the about page on a website, that page doesn't actually exist in a standalone file. It's virtual. So that's the difference in terms of what static is. It's completely pre-rendered. So also in the case of WordPress, let's leave caching aside for a second. If you request to view a page, it's basically rendered for you on the fly. That page is kind of pieced together for you in your browser. Whereas in the case of a statically generated site, that page already exists in a standalone format in HTML. And static site generators are, so if you've been in WordPress development as long as I have, like I mentioned, old, I've been around for a while in this space. If you start, you may have started building websites the same way that I did, which was we would like code individual HTML pages and then FTP them up to the server. And each page was like a standalone HTML file, right? And that was like fun and yet also terribly inconvenient because as the site got bigger and you needed to update something across the files, and that became kind of cumbersome. And anyways, there's a reason why WordPress came around and became super popular, because now you got like those issues related to cross-referencing content and taxonomies and all of that. It was solved by WordPress, which was amazing. So static site generators, in many ways, the web we keep coming full circle. So static site generators, like we're coming back to static sites where every page is standalone HTML, but in a more sophisticated way. So it's not like, I don't know what tool you use, Yoast. He seems to also have started the same way, but Dreamweaver was my tool of choice back then. You're like,
I hand coded my HTML and CSS. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But to be fair, I at that point I was a WebKit developer, so I was working on what is now the core of Chrome and Safari. So I was looking at, well, more weirdness than you were looking at, I think.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a little bit more complex than what I was doing in my little Dreamweaver tool. Okay, yeah, I was not there at all. But anyway, so static site generator is like a more sophisticated way of doing it. So there's a templating system. And so when you make changes to the site, it rolls it out across the site, hopefully in a more sophisticated, efficient way. But even that's questionable because build process can be long. Microsoft front page, totally. Although I moved away from that pretty quickly, I couldn't take it. It was such a disaster with like all the garbage that it threw at the code. That was rough.
It was really horrible.
Yeah, it was really horrible. But many sites were built with that. And then of course there was what's the graveyard for GeoCities. Created many.
It's not the graveyard for the web. It was very colorful. Very colorful.
A lot of animated GIFs. So yeah, I'm glad to see that other people. It's like nostalgic for me to talk about Dreamweaver. Anyways, so that's static. But like I said, so static's architecture is pre-rendered, static files, which creates a lot of stability, resilience in sites, and the attack surface is basically gone because there's nothing really to breach on a static site. But it's a terrible term. So someone in the web industry named Matt Biilmann, who's the co-founder of Netlify, coined the term Jamstack to make it all sound much more appealing to people who want to go towards this trend of headless and static and all that. So what is Jamstack? So actually, at first, Jamstack was meant to represent JavaScript APIs and markup. That's what the JAM stood for. And it was meant to come in opposition to the LAMP stack. Their perspective at Netlify and in this trend is, until recently, now they're kind of shifting, but it was very much like, WordPress is old school, WordPress is bad, we need something new and shiny and cool. So you all like your LAMP stack, here's the Jamstack. But that became ridiculous because if you think about it, any site is JavaScript API markup. Like it doesn't have to be like static or headless or anything. WordPress is that. So eventually they realized that it was silly making those like the capital letters, so they brought them down. But it refers to a way of doing things and not a specific stack. Like it's actually quite an amorphous term, but it did create a community. So and like a movement behind this different way of doing things. They'll say things like it's about decoupling the front end web layer from the back end business logic layer, and the idea is static first, like static as much as possible, pre-rendering as much as possible. And recently they've been embracing SSR, which stands for server-side rendering, which I think is hilarious because then people are like, what is that? We're just going back to the LAMP stack, which is server-side rendering. If that's cool, then LAMP is cool. But anyways, that's what the Jamstack is. And you may see that term, thrown around. That's why I'm just like going through it. So like I said, it was Jamstack, but now it's just Jamstack. Okay, so there's overlap between all these terms. So why are people excited for this? So let's just look at the state of WordPress. So just to be clear, I think WordPress is awesome. I have been working in it in 15 years and continue to be a big fan and proponent of it. But developers don't always feel that way. There was a survey done in 2020 of developers, and WordPress was, if you see up here, the most dreaded platform, which isn't great. And if you've been using WordPress for a while, you may have experienced any of these issues. So it can be slow, and it can have scaling issues, and it can have security issues. The legacy part here is more related to developers and how they see things. So you want to have a strong developer community around technology. Like they need to feel like it's like cool and new and shiny. They don't often feel like that about WordPress and the stack. So why are there these issues? So there's a lot of moving parts on a WordPress site, like a standard WordPress site when it's running. You've got the operating system, and then the PHP, the MySQL, and WordPress itself, and all the plugins. All this kind of needs some level of attention and updating, security, interest, and all of that. And if any of this gets overloaded or overwhelmed, it can cause performance issues, and there's a lot of stuff that could have potential vulnerabilities. So there's that, and scaling can be an issue. And anyways, it has a lot to do with this whole thing that's happening. But when you have a headless site or a statically generated site, so all of this is basically gone, and you're just left with the front end that people are hitting or visiting or requesting. So all this stuff that needs kind of attention and can relatively easily cause unbalance and then throw things out of whack in different ways, it's left behind, and it's not part of the experience. So what are the potential benefits? So because it's fully pre-rendered, you can serve it up fully through the CDN. You can do that with caching to certain extent, but people often find it hard to configure their caching well. It's pretty tricky. So, but when it's fully pre-rendered as HTML files, and there's not really much to configure there. The attack surface is reduced, like I said, so all of those potential areas of vulnerabilities are just gone. It scales effortlessly when it's static files. We've seen sites that get hit by crazy traffic spikes, like sites that go from like a couple hundred visits a day to, in the millions, basically DDoS attacks. And like the site, nobody even realized because the site just scales. It's a modern shiny tool. Okay, so that's like appealing to developers, which I do think there's a level of importance to keeping developers interested in WordPress to keep a robust community around it. I like this term, and I can't remember where I saw it, who mentioned it, but WP Ops. So like there's the term DevOps, which has to do with like keeping servers running properly and all that. So like this is about WP Ops, like all the maintenance and making sure that you're provisioned resources as necessary, preparing for campaigns, like all that kind of stuff. You can call that WP Ops. I really like that term. So there's less of that. And in some cases, which I'm going to get to in this world, you can continue using your WordPress as usual. So how? Okay, so first of all, we just have to discuss the kind of elephant in the room, which is that once you're running your site in this format, there is no database that can power your front end, really. So here's just examples of functionality that start to be challenging. Forms, comments, and a lot of stuff that's front end generated, user generated stuff. Yeah, what do you have to say about that?
No, yeah, it's funny because basically everything that's modern about the web becomes a problem.
Yeah, it definitely can. So here's just different things that can be challenging, because even relative dates where, like, if you have a blog post and it says posted yesterday, that can even be an issue on static. Not that that's very common. I'm just saying, like, a lot of the stuff that we do pretty easily on database driven site are not easy on headless, and often need to be recreated. And yeah, so just these are some of the challenges that websites can face. Okay, so how do we do this? So I mentioned the WordPress REST API, which is part of core WordPress, and WP GraphQL, which is essentially a plugin, which aims to make using the API more efficient in many ways. You can look it up. Jason Ball leads that project. It's very cool. And then just there's a lot of tooling around this approach. So you can serve your site up through Netlify. You can use Gatsby, which is a static site generator, and Gatsby has some WordPress tooling. And I think they have some themes. So this is that. With regards to this, it's very developer intensive, not just when you create the site, but also maintenance of the site, which I'm going to get to. But it's an FYI. So this is one direction. Okay, so the cons are you can't get a lot of standard WordPress functionality. Aside from the stuff that I mentioned, like we're used to updating a page in WordPress, clicking update or preview and seeing how that update impacted what your site looks like on the front end, what people are going to see. You no longer have that. It's decoupled. So whatever updates you make, you can't preview it. And so also you can't use page builders. So page builders are incredibly popular in WordPress for good reason. It makes it easy for people to create nice pages or customized pages on the fly. And it works because of the monolithic architecture of WordPress, and that won't work in a decoupled architecture. You need to recreate common WordPress functionality. So when I see tutorials about how to run WordPress, let's say, in a headless format, there's often tutorials around things that we just take for granted, like RSS feeds. So you have to recreate all of that. Forms, 301 redirects. It demands much more developer resources on an ongoing basis, because instead of creating your page on the fly like you could if you're a marketer or content creator, now you need to pull developer resources to make sure that it's hooked into the front end. So it can be frustrating for non-devs. Okay, this is another interesting tool in the WordPress landscape. It's called Frontity. What Frontity does is it allows you to run a front end of WordPress or a theme, but based in React instead of PHP. So for developers who prefer to develop in React instead of PHP, they can do that. And they've created a lot of integrations with WordPress. So stuff that works on native WordPress will often work on Frontity. Not everything, it's still like reinventing the wheel on many levels, but it's a very, very interesting approach. So if you are a company and your developers are like, no PHP, only React, this could be a good solution for them. It's decoupled to get some of the advantages of that. It's future oriented, you could say, because it's not LAMP based, but you're missing a lot of WordPress functionality. It demands React knowledge, and it's actually not statically generated. So there's still dependency on the WordPress backend and stuff like that. So you don't totally get all the benefits of headless and decoupled or static, actually. Okay, so I'm going to talk about static now. So static is running a generation process, a build process across your WordPress site and pre-rendering every page in its own standalone HTML file. And as I mentioned, the benefits of that are it's fast, right? Every page is pre-rendered, so it doesn't have to be generated for you. The caching is really, really easy because it's just all kind of like the ultimate cache in many ways, and it can be fully served up through a CDN. Scaling no longer is an issue, and there's really not much to hack on a site that's just a collection of static files. So there's a number of ways you can approach this. There's plugins that do this. So there's Simply Static and there's WP to Static. Just to disclose, the developer of WP to Static now works at Stratix, which we're very happy about. He's great. But WP to Static is still available. Yeah. And it's, the project is there, and he continues to work on it to a certain extent. So that's like, for people, it's free. It demands, a lot of tweaking, like plugging things in and trying to you have to take care of your whole environment, and security can still be an issue, and it can fail in different ways. Well, it's complicated, but it's doable. There are like quite a lot of sites that run on these plugins. They've gotten it up and running, and yeah. So the pros are free. You get the benefits of static. You can choose your hosting for your WordPress site, but it's important to make sure that the WordPress site is still secure, because if you have vulnerabilities there, it could be hacked. It's quite complicated to configure with these plugins, and an issue is making sure that the original WordPress site can handle the scraping process, the build process, and not fail or not crash under the load, because it's actually quite a heavy load. So you need to actually still do some WP ops to a certain extent. WP security is still an issue, and it is missing WordPress functionality. The no database list that I mentioned, a lot of that is not supported. Okay, so then you have the end-to-end platforms. Strattic is one of them, where your site is, it's an end-to-end platform that takes care of the WordPress hosting part, the static site generation part, and the CDN. So you don't have to configure anything. So I'll talk about Strattic, because that's where I work. I know it's shocking.
It's how you make your money. It's nothing to be ashamed of.
Thank you. Yeah. So Strattic is end-to-end. So our users get the entire platform taken care of for them. They don't have to configure anything. They don't have to plug anything in. They don't have to worry about the WordPress server failing or anything like that, or configuring the CDN, making sure it invalidates upon updating so that people actually see your updates. All of that is taken care of. Yeah, but in Strattic, the WordPress site is in a containerized environment, so it's very secure, and also it shuts down when not in use, which is an added layer of security. Everything's configured for you. You get to use WordPress as usual, so you don't have to learn another approach to anything like you might have to do with the other tooling. But you get all the benefits of Headless, because the site is, the front end is completely separated from the WordPress site. So speed, security, scalability, all that, you get that. You don't have to redo your site in this new emerging world of Headless, everything, not just WordPress. You generally have to take whatever site you have and throw it away and build a new one. On Strattic, you don't have to do that. It supports existing WordPress websites, so no need for that wastefulness. You get staging sites on WordPress. You can have staging WordPress sites, but you also get two static sites. You get a preview static site and a live static site. So if you make a change to your WordPress site, you want to make sure that it works well on static, you can publish first to the preview, see how that looks. That's your private static, and then publish to production. And we've rolled out support for what is generally dynamic, like database rendered functionality. It works on the static version of the site. So forms, 301 redirects, including Yoast 301 redirects, search, WPML, and Polylang. Yep, big fans of Yoast, obviously. Great tool. RSS feeds are all there, and user management, which is also something you often have to reinvent when you use Headless, which is, it's hard to imagine. So this can all work if we have a static first or Headless first mindset. There's ways that you can, like if you use a tool like WP to Static or something else, a lot of database-driven functionality, there's replacements for it, alternatives for it today. So we're very much in a client-side JavaScript based world. So there's a lot of tools out there that can replace plugins. And we actually created a directory on our site. So you can go to Strattic, Learn, and then the drop-down tools. And you can look, like if you need a new commenting solution, you can look at our comment category. If you need a new donations, whatever, events management, you can find tools that work well on Strattic, obviously. Some of them only work well on Strattic, but most of them work well on Static. So basically, I call this having your cake and eating it too. So when you generate a static version of, and I like cake, so I'm happy to talk about it when I can. So if you generate a static version of your site, it looks and feels the same. Like people wouldn't know. And even if you look at the source code, like on Strattic, it still looks like a WordPress site. There's no WordPress underneath. So you get all of that, but you get all the benefits of static. Okay, here's a happy customer, increased conversion rates, Payoneer, they're a big fintech company. Okay, so a few things to offer listeners. One is we have what I think is a useful guide, Static First Guide to WordPress. You can go to bit.ly/static-first-wp and download the ebook. We have other ebooks on our site under resources, which you can check out and download. And for the Yoast community, we've never offered this before, but if you go to strattic.com/Yoast, you can get 6 months free of Strattic. We have a free trial anyways. but you can go here and get 6 months free. For our solo plan generally limits our customers to 1 user per account, but you can have unlimited users also. So 6 months free and unlimited users. And yeah, so that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Well, this is actually a good story. There is so much here that we'll have to talk about a bit more after I do my slides. So if you stop sharing your screen, then I'll start sharing mine.
Okay, and I'll try to hide my face, so it's only your face.
No, you don't have to, because Taco will take care of that with his magic.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Fantastic.
Look, there he does it. So yes, so you might be thinking, with all the things that Miriam just said, like, there's so many ways of doing this, and you'd be right, because there are a ton of ways of doing things in the headless WordPress world, and to be honest, not all of them make sense, but most do. What is important to realize is that in headless, and this is different than in static, because in static, you can just run Yoast SEO and everything works fine. But in headless, you are suddenly, you have to take care of your metadata. So you have to make sure that you output our Yoast SEO stuff. But before I talk to you about that, I need to talk to you about something else. If you're going to use a platform like Gatsby or Frontity or whatever, you also have another set of problems to run into, and that is JavaScript SEO. The whole JavaScript SEO conundrum is like, we could spend an entire webinar on that by itself. If we did, I would invite my great friend Bartosz from Onely, who wrote this guide. This is a lot of work. The reason all these people go to pre-render and other solutions like that is because otherwise SEO on JavaScript heavy sites becomes really, really problematic. Now, I'm not going to deal with that all of that right now. I'm sorry if you thought I was going to. I'm going to just point you at this guide and say, hey, go there and read that and do everything it says. Now, about 1.5 years ago, maybe almost 2 years ago, we started on a project called The Indexables. And what we did in that project is we created a table within WordPress that stores all of our metadata. Now, how is this related to headless WordPress? Well, one of the problems that you run into is that we need to have all the metadata for a URL or a slug like that on the fly. And we don't have an actual WordPress head call, or because there is no head, so we can't output our head code. So we started on the indexables, and the indexables actually power everything that we do in Yoast SEO in terms of headless. They also power all of our metadata in normal normal WordPress mode, but it's important here to realize that most of what we do in terms of SEO for headless would be impossible to do this well without our indexables project. Now, we have a couple of ways of doing this. As Miriam mentioned, you have the REST API, and there's actually 2 types of integrations in there. We have a Yoast head attribute that we add to the REST API. So if you open the request for a post or page, then there will be a Yoast head attribute that contains the entire blob of metadata that we think should be on the page. So you can just take that and output it. We also give you a Yoast head JSON attribute that has an array or an object of all the different things, all the values that we have. I think this is, relatively speaking, a very simple way of doing things. If you want to look at what that looks like, you're very welcome to look at it on Yoast.com. You can throw in the slug of any recent posts. This is today's post about our new e-commerce SEO training. And it simply, well, gives you all the metadata and basically all the data for that post as well. Another option, as Miriam mentioned, is GraphQL. And there's actually a pretty darn good WP GraphQL Yoast SEO add-on that adds all the Yoast SEO fields into WP GraphQL output. We are looking at embedding that into Yoast SEO core, and we haven't gotten there yet, but we will somewhere, I hope, in the next 6 months. And then Miriam mentioned Frontity, and Frontity has also built a Yoast package, so it's actually very simple to implement Yoast SEO in Frontity as well. Now, the great thing about Strattic, and also the reason why I don't have a slide about them, is that you can just run Yoast SEO on Strattic. That makes life a lot easier. One of the other things I thought that Miriam would mention, and she did nicely, is, hey, you have to solve a few other problems. One of them is search. And as you might have seen on our slides, one of their recommended solutions for search is Algolia. Well, we actually built a very cool integration with Algolia and the WordPress Algolia plugin by Web Dev Studios. I think I saw Brad in the chat. So hi, Brad. There's a shout out to their awesome Algolia plugin that we have built an integration with into Yoast SEO so that you can use data from Yoast SEO both in the results and in the ranking of your Algolia searches. And that's it, I think, for me. And then we asked Miriam to come back, and we asked Taco because we need someone to actually take care of us.
Yes, well, I'm back. Don't worry.
I do just want to mention, which I didn't mention. I did kind of mention that, there's all this. I mentioned that there's all these tools that people can use to replace functionality. We didn't mention is that also on Strattic we integrate Algolia out of the box for our users. So they click our publish button and they have Algolia powered search on the Strattic site.
Algolia is awesome. We use Algolia on Yoast.com as well. So honestly, Yoast.com is not headless, but we do employ a lot of the static tactics on Yoast.com. So our blog posts, when you hit them, you're hitting statically cached pages in Cloudflare.
That's very cool.
And if you submit a comment, you'll hit our database, and then we'll push a new version to Cloudflare. So
that's very cool. I have a feeling that a lot of people, including myself, would love to know the inner workings of Yoast.com and how, because it's for sure high traffic.
Yoast.com is high traffic. It's a lot more servers than the average infrastructure.
I can imagine.
I think we have 5 front ends, 2
really?
2 backend databases. Yeah. So the problem is WooCommerce is a very expensive thing to run at large traffic.
Right.
Yeah, so it is what it is. But yeah, no, yeah. And our customer portal is custom built as well. So we have a custom built Node.js customer portal that sits on top of our WooCommerce. So there's a lot of moving parts there.
I remember when you guys launched your customer portal. I remember it was one of the WordCamps, and your team was like really excited about that you're about to launch it. So
it is. I think it's still. I'm still not entirely happy with everything that we've built there, but I think it is really good. But one of the things I did want to ask you, Miriam,
yes,
and that we haven't really answered yet, is why should you want headless? And,
yeah.
Or maybe I should remove the why. Should you want headless?
So I hope that during this conversation, you will share with the world what you really think about headless, because you have quite a strong opinion. But I think, not surprisingly, that, okay, in an ideal situation, whatever that means, headless brings a lot of benefits. And we see that with our own customers. Our customers are different companies and organizations that were facing challenges running WordPress in its standard format. So Yoast.com is quite a sophisticated configuration on many levels, right? But not most companies can't do that. Like, they're not actually like WordPress companies, right? So getting that whole thing set up is really, really challenging. So we have customers that came to us because they were having scaling issues, they were having downtime issues, they were having security issues. We have a customer that came to us because their whole site and everything was like ransomware, and they were like, never again. Like, not everyone can always keep up on all of the updating on all the levels, and then like provisioning resources, they run a campaign and the site, slows down or crashes, or it's too painful. So basically on Strattic, at least, our customers report something. I don't think they expected this when they moved on to Strattic. They wanted to solve particular issues, but peace of mind. So if you're running WordPress, it tends to be, I call it like a delicate flower that needs watering and nurturing, because it's like, and you never know when something is going to use a very sophisticated term, bork. So I like, white screen of death, or plug and update that's whatever, or who knows what. And often it happens like when you're sleeping, and it just, it's too unpredictable and like unstable in many ways. So for companies running sites where their WordPress site is really important to them, it's business tools, lead generation, it's, brand, it's all of that. They can't afford to have those issues. And also they don't want to have to deal with it anymore. So that's where Headless comes in. But like we were saying, I don't know if we got this across, but implementing Headless in many ways really complicated and brings its own complexities. I mentioned before we got on about a site where they redid it Headless, but they had too many REST API endpoints, and so they still were having scaling issues. Like it's
certainly not simpler.
No, exactly. It's not
simpler. And so I'll share my opinion. For large publishers that actually have different places where they use their content. So if you actually have more than one place where you use your content, like an app or a TV thing or whatever, at that point, Headless makes sense.
I have a question about that, which I always have when people bring that up. If you're running standard WordPress, you still have the REST API. Why do you have to make WordPress Headless?
I agree with you, and I don't think it's still even the best solution. But at that point, it's at least not utter nonsense. But for most cases where people do Headless, I think that it's over-architecting something that should be taken care of by just better hosting. And in many ways, the things that you at Strattic differentiate yourself with are things that, in my mind, should be part of just proper WordPress hosting.
Could be.
And so, for instance, the Algolia stuff. One of the hardest problems to solve in WordPress is proper search, because WordPress itself doesn't have proper search. And honestly, we're never going to solve that within WordPress, because we need more code than all of WordPress has now to make it a proper search algorithm. So why would we want that? So implementing something like Algolia or something else, whether that's Elastic or something, you slowly see all the managed hosting service go there and say like, hey, we'll implement this for you. Right. And that also takes away an attack vector on WordPress sites, because if WordPress sites are attacked, 9 times out of 10, it's by sending random search strings to sites, because it's a great way of breaking a WordPress site. That's why our search page is static and uses just Algolia, because otherwise we'd get DDoS to bits. Right. So in many ways, I don't think most people need Headless, and I think it adds more complexity. At the same time, I do think that, well, what you're doing at Strattic is actually a very cool solution, and something that a lot more people should slowly strive towards, to have more of their pages be static.
Yeah, I agree. I think standard managed hosting companies, I'm not sure that they can do what Strattic is doing, just because in order to do it, the architecture that we've had to build out, the infrastructure, is really different. In a way, we turn hosting on its head. Like on standard hosting, the scaling part is the complicated and expensive part. On Strattic, that's the easy and simple part. Once the site is static and being served up to the CDN, throw whatever you want at it, it's all fine. it just works. So our complexity is on the static site generation process, which we have had to, improve constantly in order to make it, first of all, like faster, and also not fail on any level. So to make sure we capture every single URL and let's say every 301 redirect, and all that, like everything, every image, like that, it's all properly updated. It's not a simple process. And so managed hosting companies in their current logical infrastructure, you can't just you can't just do that. And then with regards to the Algolia example, so I think that's like more related to how do we use WordPress for what it's really good for and offload or outsource the stuff that it's not so good for. So, you know, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this. I'm sure it serves a purpose, but when I see like WordPress being used as like a CRM, just like, that's not what it's good at. And that's why like search will never be good in WordPress, because it's not WordPress is not a search product. It's a CMS that also has search in it. So, you know, using WordPress for its core value, which is a lot of value. One of the reasons why I created Strattic was because at a certain point, I started to think, well, maybe WordPress's time has come. Maybe it's time to look at something that's more modern and, you know, will bring more value to my clients and my agency. And after exploring what was out there in this emerging Jamstack world, I was like, no, WordPress is it. Because in the end, who manages websites on a day-to-day basis? Not the developers who want the shiny tool. It's content creators, it's business people. They don't care if the underlying technology is fancier or shinier. They just want to be able to create their landing page and press publish and it's there. So WordPress is still brings tremendous value as a content management system. I think it is really best in breed, or whatever the term is. But it has those architecture issues. So that's what like Stratix is trying to like fit itself in between, where you can get all the benefits of headless, Jamstack, static, all that stuff, but you don't have to redo your site. You don't have to learn anything new. All you have to do is actually click a button, and then you get the best of both worlds. So yeah.
Yeah. So on Strattic, something like Elementor would just work, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot of customers who use Elementor, who use Gutenberg. I think we have a few other page builders. I can't remember. That's all fine because it creates front end. It renders the front end on WordPress, and then it's captured on the version. Yeah.
Now, it's one of the things that drives me nuts in all of these discussions is that people seem to want to reinvent things that we've already invented. And I mean, when you're building sites in React because you like it better than PHP, I'm like, yeah, whatever. But if you then go to server-side render your React, I'm like, you might have well stuck with PHP, right?
Exactly.
So it is, yeah. I don't really get that, even though we have like a ton of React developers within Yoast, right? Because all of the backend of WordPress is now slowly turning into React. I just don't see all of the advantage of that. One of the things that one of the questions that's in the Q&A I wanted to touch on: how do you deal with WooCommerce?
That is a good question. That is our next big challenge. We have sites running on Strattic that use it just for the catalog functionality, but the checkout process is still an issue. But we're actually working, hopefully soon, starting to work on something exciting where the shopping cart functionality would be also offloaded. So the experience would seem the same, and you wouldn't have to go off the site. But that processing would happen not within WordPress, but within a different tool. But yeah, that's a good question, and we're not there yet. E-commerce is challenging.
So that's why it's one of those things that is actually going to be pretty hard to solve well for, I think. Especially with all the add-ons that exist for WooCommerce that make life easier on normal WooCommerce sites that you'll then have to replicate in yet another environment.
Yeah, but I think the reason why it's possible, I do think that the WooCommerce market will want to move to headless. Let's say hopefully we will create this implementation, and it will be limited, right? There's no way we can support every plugin, every integration. But let's say we have alternatives or whatever. I think people may be willing to suffer that pain of replacing their functionality to get the greater speed and resilience of headless, because we get a lot of people reaching out to us saying, when will you support WooCommerce? Because the performance is such a major issue there.
Yeah, WooCommerce has a huge performance problem, and well, we've done a lot of work mitigating that on Yostcom, but it's definitely there. I want to highlight.
Well, I would like to tie into that because we have a slightly more general question than specifically for WooCommerce, and that is by David. Should you want headless for e-commerce at all? So not specifically WooCommerce, but
I think it comes back to Joost was saying, which is ideally the hosting will be better. Like maybe that's one aspect of it, which is if you could run WooCommerce in its current state and get the performance and reliability out of it that you want, then you don't need headless. But I don't know how that's going to happen because it's just got so many issues within it.
Honestly, though, with if you track all the investments that Automatic has been doing over the last year, then there must be something coming, because
you think?
They've invested in this company called Strattic, in this company called in this company called Frontity that we mentioned before. I mean, there is so much here that Automatic is looking at. I think that there's a lot of there is a lot of stuff there that they could do to make that a bit easier, and it would be sensible if they did.
Yeah, I can't speak exactly to Automatic's motivation, even though they did invest in this company called Stratix, which I happen to know about. But I think in general in the WordPress space, and this webinar is kind of part of it, which is like WordPress has been done in a particular way for a very long time, right? 18 years. And the internet is moving at a tremendous pace, and there's a lot of new technology. And while often it seems like we're just reinventing the wheel, there's a reason that new technology exists. It does things often better. So I think what's happening now, like between us and Frontity and other projects, is that we're trying to see how can we like kind of take WordPress into the future, and like ensure its place there. Where does it fit in within these new technological approaches and solutions? So who knows, where everything will fall in the end, but I think that's part of it.
I fully agree with that. I mean, we on our SEO news webinars often do too much free promotion for Cloudflare, because so much of what we do at Yoast and how we solve these problems relies on Cloudflare. Mm-hmm. Which is also not ideal because it's a proprietary platform that so there has to be better ways for a lot of this, and I think we're slowly figuring it out together, so that's good.
Yeah, I agree. I think
I did want to get to Eveline's question. Isn't headless just adding another needless layer of complexity? Well, for most sites, my answer would be yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we did cover that. In many cases, it's totally what it's doing, because you have to reinvent the wheel on so many levels, and moving forward with your site becomes much more complex than in the past. But Strattic tries to,
I think that they're two in that way, two different things, because you can move to Strattic, and especially if your site is relatively static in itself, then that could be quite painless.
Yeah, totally. We have people come to Stratix, sign up, and go live, and like we don't even hear from them. And the vast majority of sites are what you're calling relatively static, in that they create content that's front-end content, right? And they update the pages on their site, they create new pages, they update their blog, and whatever, all that kind of stuff. And that works great on Stratix. So, yeah.
Cool. Are there any other systems that we should questions we should look at, Taco?
Yeah, I think so, because I think we touched on quite a few examples of why not to go headless. But the question by Gislaine van Berkom is, what is a typical type of company you would recommend to go headless?
So, for me, one of my go-to examples of things on the web, because I used to work there and with them, is The Guardian. And The Guardian had a content API way before headless was cool, because they had a content API for their website, their app, and they had different apps for different ecosystems at that time, etc. At that point, it makes sense to separate your content from your front end, especially if the content is presented differently on different platforms. But then it also means that you just use your CMS as a content authoring exercise, and the design has to be taken care of elsewhere, which also doesn't really work with how nice we want our web pages to look now, because then you want to actually be able to make them up and to design them. But I'm interested to hear your perspective here as well, Miriam.
I agree that it seems to be like very large scale media sites where headless makes sense for them, because it allows them to scale. That's generally their biggest concern, scale and performance. So, but yeah, your backend just becomes like a form where you're just plugging in content and pressing publish, which might also make sense for them because then there's more control over, the visual delivery. But even within that case, I try to speak to agencies and that are working with headless implementations to understand how it's going for them, their pain points. And often I hear things like, well, we just created greater complexity because now there's many different levels or tools that we're using. And so when there's a point of failure, it's hard for us to identify it. That's one thing. The other is that the REST API doesn't scale so well. It can be quite slow. And so if you're dependent on it, that can have performance issues. So, but it is also a new emerging kind of space, particularly in WordPress. So, people might need to just develop better ways of doing this. But coming back to Strattic, any site that's smaller than that could be headless on Strattic because you can just put it on Strattic and get it right out of the box. So, so there's that if you want to see what it's like.
I do think that static or a semi-static or is something that almost every site should look at for a lot of their content.
Yeah, it just removes a lot of pain points and a lot of that like nurturing that WordPress needs. And on Strattic, because WordPress is completely separated and it's in its own containerized environment, if someone does update a plugin, for example, and something breaks or someone does something to it, that's fine. It has no impact on the static version of the site. And you can like fix things in like decent time instead of in hysteria and pressure, So
we never have stress like that, do we, Taco?
Absolutely not. No, never.
Everything just runs perfectly smoothly all the time, right?
Definitely.
Of course it does.
I think it would run a lot smoother all of the time if I stopped cowboy coding.
Don't do that.
Since you're still my boss, I'm not commenting on that one.
Yeah,
everyone has issues. I can't. Yeah,
I might be the only person who actually deploys things after 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And
oh my gosh! Oh no.
All right. So before you're spilling all the secrets, Joost, I have 2 more questions that I really would like an answer to. And the first one is actually an SEO question. If your site's really struggling with SEO, in spite of seemingly meeting all of Google's requirements, could the headless speed increase potentially help with rankings?
No.
That's a quick one.
No, yeah. Honestly, if your site is really struggling, then your problem is not your speed. If your site is really struggling, then usually your problem is your content and your internal linking structure.
And I'll just say, with all due respect to speed and performance, which of course is a big selling point for Strattic, I think Google has created a hysteria around that, where people are like super obsessed with it, and they're like, just all they care about is their core web vital score. And like you're saying, there's so many other things that impact SEO that you need to pay attention to, and everyone's throwing everything into that basket. It just seems like a bit much. I don't know why it ended up being like that, but yeah.
It's what Google does when they create new stuff for people to look at.
They make everyone's like in a frenzy.
Yeah,
that's what it's like. So
All right. And then we have a final question on Strattic. We've touched on it a few times already today. But does Stratix solve theme bloat? The user
Yeah,
sees
that's
as
a
I
really good
use
question.
a theme and there's a lot of JavaScript bloat. Do you have a way to clean that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if a theme is really badly built, then when moving to Strattic, they'll generally see a speed increase across the board. There is a speed increase, but the poor coding will still be there. So the JavaScript will still be there. And so while you'll see a speed increase, and what we've seen is that the way that the Core Web Vitals works is that it's based on real time usage. People, oh, am I frozen? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, great. It's based on real-time usage. So like while the Core Vital score might at the beginning be not quite what they like, as time goes on, it's running on Strattic because it's fast. That starts to impact the score. But like render blocking JavaScript will still be rendered blocking JavaScript. We're working on some really exciting functionality where we're trying to improve the site on every level, not just like by publishing a static queue solves speed and security and all that, but also even on that level. So I don't have an ETA on that, but that's the goal. So, but for now, it's still a thing.
All right. And with that, we've hit the full hour.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much
Thanks for having me. Bye.
See you.